The pastor stole $50,000 from church funds until I exposed him during Sunday service in front of the entire congregation. My name is Wilhelmina Grace Robinson, and at 74 years old, I had been the treasurer of Mount Olive Baptist Church for 26 years, managing every dollar that came through our doors with the devotion of someone handling God's own money. But when our new pastor, Marcus Johnson, began stealing from the building fund, I knew I had to choose between protecting a corrupt minister and protecting the sacred mission of our church. Mount Olive Baptist Church had been the cornerstone of our community for over 60 years, serving not only as a place of worship, but as a food bank, homeless shelter, and community center for families in need. I had joined the church in 1997 when my late husband Jerome and I moved to Atlanta, and had immediately volunteered to help with the financial management because of my background as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. When the previous treasurer, Sister Elizabeth, passed away in 1999, I was asked to take over her duties, managing donations, tracking expenses, and ensuring that every penny was used according to the wishes of our congregation for 24 years. I had maintained meticulous records of every offering, every tithe, every special collection, and every expenditure, making sure that our church funds were spent wisely and transparently. Mount Olive had grown steadily under the leadership of Reverend Thomas Crawford, who had pastored our church for 32 years until his retirement in 2022. Reverend Crawford had been a man of absolute integrity who lived modestly despite having opportunities to enrich himself through the generous donations of our prosperous congregation. Under Reverend Crawford's leadership, we had paid off our mortgage, established an emergency fund, and accumulated over $100,000 in our building improvement fund. The building fund was intended to finance a new community center that would expand our ability to serve families in need by providing job training, computer classes, and childcare services. Our congregation had worked tirelessly to raise money for this project, holding bake sales, car washes, and special offerings to build the fund dollar by dollar over several years. When Reverend Crawford retired, we were finally ready to break ground on the community center that had been his dream and ours for over a decade. But finding a new pastor proved more challenging than expected because many candidates were intimidated by Reverend Crawford's legacy and by the high standards our congregation expected. After 6 months of searching, our deacon board hired Pastor Marcus Johnson, a charismatic preacher in his early 40s who had impressive credentials and came highly recommended by other churches. Pastor Johnson preached with passion and energy that reinvigorated our worship services and attracted new members who were drawn to his dynamic speaking style. At first, I was pleased with Pastor Johnson's leadership and was optimistic about the future direction of our church under his guidance. But within 3 months of his arrival, I began noticing irregularities in our financial records that raised serious concerns about Pastor Johnson's integrity. The first red flag was when Pastor Johnson requested access to all church bank accounts, claiming that he needed to understand our financial position before making ministry decisions. I explained that the treasurer traditionally managed all financial matters with oversight from the deacon board and that previous pastors had been content to receive monthly financial reports. But Pastor Johnson insisted that as the spiritual leader of the church, he needed direct access to our funds to make informed decisions about ministry priorities. Reluctantly, the deacon board agreed to give Pastor Johnson signatory authority on all church accounts, though I argued that this violated our traditional financial safeguards. The second warning sign came when Pastor Johnson began making expensive purchases without prior approval from the deacon board or the finance committee. He bought new furniture for his office, installed an expensive sound system, and purchased a luxury car that he claimed was necessary for his pastoral duties. When I questioned these expenditures, Pastor Johnson said they were essential investments in the ministry and that I was being overly cautious about spending church money. Pastor Johnson also began taking frequent trips that he described as conferences and ministry events, but he provided minimal documentation about these expenses. By his 6th month at Mount Olive, I realized that our building fund was shrinking at an alarming rate despite continued donations from the congregation. When I reviewed the bank statements, I discovered that large amounts were being transferred from the building fund to accounts that I could not identify. When I confronted Pastor Johnson about these transfers, he claimed they were temporary loans to help with cash flow and that the money would be returned within a few weeks. But weeks passed and the money was never returned to the building fund. I also discovered that Pastor Johnson had been writing checks to vendors that I could not verify and claiming reimbursements for expenses that seemed excessive. When I asked for receipts and documentation, Pastor Johnson became defensive and accused me of questioning his integrity. He also suggested that my concerns were based on my inability to understand modern ministry practices and that I was being resistant to change. But I knew the difference between legitimate ministry expenses and theft, and Pastor Johnson's spending patterns clearly indicated that he was stealing church money. I decided to conduct a thorough audit of all church finances without informing Pastor Johnson about my investigation. What I discovered was even worse than I had suspected. Over 9 months, Pastor Johnson had stolen over $50,000 from various church accounts, including nearly $30,000 from the building fund. He had written checks to fake vendors, created false invoices for services, never provided and transferred money to personal accounts under the guise of ministry expenses. Pastor Johnson had also been submitting fraudulent expense reports claiming reimbursement for travel meals and accommodations that either never occurred or cost far less than he claimed. Most shocking of all, I discovered that Pastor Johnson had been using church credit cards for personal purchases, including expensive clothing, jewelry, and entertainment. The evidence was overwhelming and clearly showed that Pastor Johnson was systematically defrauding our congregation. I knew I had to expose his theft, but I also knew that confronting him privately would give him the opportunity to destroy evidence or manipulate the deacon board. I decided that the most effective way to expose Pastor Johnson's crimes was to reveal them publicly during a Sunday service when the entire congregation would witness his response. I prepared a detailed financial report documenting every fraudulent transaction, every false invoice, and every stolen dollar. The report included copies of bank statements, canceled checks, and credit card records that provided undeniable evidence of Pastor Johnson's theft. On the Sunday morning, when I planned to expose Pastor Johnson, I arrived at church early and placed copies of the financial report on every pew. I also prepared a brief presentation that would explain the evidence to the congregation in terms that everyone could understand. During the service, I waited until Pastor Johnson finished his sermon and called for the offering before asking for permission to make a special announcement. I told the congregation that as their treasurer, I had discovered serious financial irregularities that required immediate attention. Pastor Johnson initially tried to prevent me from speaking, claiming that financial matters should be discussed privately in committee meetings. But I insisted that since the congregation had donated the money, they had a right to know how their contributions were being used. I then presented the evidence of Pastor Johnson's theft, reading directly from bank statements and showing the congregation copies of fraudulent checks. The sanctuary fell completely silent as I detailed how Pastor Johnson had stolen $50,000 from the building fund and other church accounts. I explained how he had created fake vendors, submitted false expense reports, and used church credit cards for personal purchases. The congregation was shocked, and many members began weeping as they realized that their trusted pastor had been stealing from them. Pastor Johnson stood at the pulpit looking trapped and desperate as the evidence against him mounted. He initially tried to deny the accusations, claiming that there had been accounting errors and misunderstandings. But when confronted with specific documentation, Pastor Johnson finally admitted that he had made mistakes in handling church finances. He claimed that he had only borrowed money temporarily and that he had planned to repay everything before anyone noticed. Pastor Johnson also tried to blame me for the financial problems, claiming that my record keeping was inadequate and that I had failed to properly monitor church expenses. But the congregation was not fooled by his excuses because the evidence clearly showed systematic theft rather than accounting errors. Several deacons immediately called for Pastor Johnson's resignation and demanded that he repay all stolen funds. Pastor Johnson refused to resign and claimed that he was being persecuted for trying to modernize the church's financial practices. But the congregation voted unanimously to remove Pastor Johnson from his position and to report his crimes to law enforcement. Within hours of the service, Pastor Johnson packed his belongings and left town without making any attempt to repay the stolen money. The police investigation confirmed my findings and resulted in felony charges for theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Pastor Johnson was eventually arrested in another state where he had been attempting to defraud another congregation. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 5 years in state prison with orders to pay full restitution to our church. The trial received significant media attention and led to new oversight procedures for religious organizations in our state. Our congregation used Pastor Johnson's theft as a learning experience that resulted in stronger financial controls and better oversight procedures. We established new policies requiring dual signatures for all expenditures over $500, monthly financial reports to the congregation, and annual independent audits. We also implemented background checks and reference verification for all church leadership positions. Despite the trauma of Pastor Johnson's betrayal, our church emerged stronger and more united than ever. The congregation rallied together to rebuild our building fund, and within 2 years, we had not only recovered the stolen money, but had exceeded our original fundraising goal. We broke ground on our new community center in 2024 and dedicated the building in honor of Reverend Crawford, who had first envisioned the project. The community center now serves over 300 families annually, providing job training, computer classes, childcare services, and emergency assistance. My role in exposing Pastor Johnson's theft earned me respect throughout our religious community and led to invitations to speak at other churches about financial oversight. I use these opportunities to educate congregations about protecting themselves from pastoral financial abuse and implementing proper safeguards. Several other churches discovered their own financial irregularities after hearing my presentations and were able to recover stolen funds and prosecute corrupt leaders. My experience taught me that protecting a church mission sometimes requires confronting trusted leaders who have violated that trust. Wilhelmina Grace Robinson proved that faithful stewardship means being willing to expose corruption, even when it comes from those who claim to speak for God. The $50,000 that Pastor Johnson stole was eventually recovered through restitution payments from his prison earnings. But more importantly, our congregation learned that true spiritual leadership requires integrity, transparency, and accountability. Pastor Johnson spent his 5 years in prison thinking about how his greed had destroyed his ministry and his relationship with God. When he was released, he moved to another state, and as far as I know, never attempted to return to pastoral ministry. The community center that he tried to steal from now stands as a testament to what faithful congregations can accomplish when they protect their resources from corrupt leaders. Mount Olive Baptist Church continues to thrive under new pastoral leadership that embraces transparency and accountability. My story became a reminder that churches must guard against financial predators who use religious authority to steal from faithful believers. The congregation that Pastor Johnson tried to exploit became an example of how communities can recover from betrayal and emerge stronger than before. Wilhelmina Grace Robinson showed that sometimes the most faithful act is refusing to remain silent when witnessing theft from God's house. The Sunday service where I exposed Pastor Johnson's crimes became the day our church reclaimed its integrity and its mission. The building fund that he nearly destroyed became the foundation for a community center that serves hundreds of families in need. My 26 years as church treasurer taught me that managing God's money requires the same vigilance needed to protect any valuable treasure. Pastor Marcus Johnson learned too late that stealing from a church means stealing from God and from people who trust religious leaders to protect their sacred contributions. The financial safeguards we implemented after his theft now serve as a model for other churches seeking to prevent similar crimes. Mount Olive Baptist Church proved that congregations who demand accountability from their leaders can overcome even serious betrayals. The transparency that Pastor Johnson tried to avoid became the foundation of our stronger, more faithful community. Wilhelmina Grace Robinson demonstrated that church treasurers have a sacred duty to protect congregational resources, even when that protection requires confronting pastoral corruption. The $50,000 was just money, but the integrity of our church was priceless and worth every difficult moment required to preserve it.